Most English learners study grammar. The ones who actually become fluent, they listen a lot. These are real conversations, real accents, real speed. No slowdowns, no simplifications. Just you, the audio, and the words on screen. What's the number one mistake people make when hiking in the mountains? It's not what you think. In this audio, a safer expert gives real practical advice, the kind that could save your life. And while you listen, every word appears on screen so you can follow along, absorb the vocabulary, and train your ear to natural British English.
Safety in the hills.
Well, in case all this talk about mountaineering and the open-air life tempts you to go out on the hills yourself, here's some timely advice on how not to run the kind of risks that can get you into trouble, from Tim Barrow. Tim, what advice would you give?
Well, above all, you've got to use your common sense and not try to do what you're not trained to do. First of all, for example, you shouldn't set out into the hills by yourself. That's the worst thing you can do. It's best to have at least 4 people in the party so that 2 can go for help if someone is injured, while the third person stays with the person who's hurt.
Oh, that sounds as if you expect everyone to hurt themselves, Tim.
Haha, no, of course not. But you've got to be careful, and if you take precautions, then you're going to enjoy your walking. You should expect, for example, bad weather.
Yes.
You shouldn't rely on the accuracy of weather forecasts because things can change very, very quickly. You give yourself plenty of time to get where you're going to go, and especially, to take into account darkness so that it doesn't catch you up and leave you still out in the hills.
Yes.
Don't leave anyone behind. You should walk as slowly as the slowest walker. Now, if the visibility does get bad due to fog or low-lying cloud, the best thing is not to go on walking. Stop and wait for it to get better. Otherwise, you might walk over a precipice or something horrendous like that. You need to take, most important a map and compass, because it can be disastrous if you try and follow your nose and expect your sense of direction to get you anywhere.
Yes. And how about clothes and equipment?
Well, crucial. You've got to take precautions, be prepared for the wet, even if when you start out it looks warm and sunny. You just can't assume that it's going to stay that way. So take warm clothes and waterproof ones at that. Next, you should take proper walking boots, not sandals, things like that, and not jeans, which, yes, I know lots of people wear jeans, but they just don't protect you against the wind or the rain. Another important thing, before you set out, you should actually let people know where you're going and what time you'll be back.
Yes.
Then, if you do get into difficulties, you've got a chance of being rescued. And very important, when you do get back, to report that you've arrived safely back. Otherwise, everyone will be terribly worried. That's very important.
Yes. Well, that's good advice. Thanks, Tim.
One man, 5 continents, the North Pole, alone. Naomi Uemura didn't just break records, he redefined what's humanly possible. In this audio, a journalist tells his incredible story. As you listen, you'll train your ear on natural spoken English, narrative tenses, sequencing language, and the kind of vocabulary that comes up in Cambridge Proficiency and IELTS academic listening.
A Japanese adventurer.
Among the most remarkable of all the present-day adventurers is the Japanese Naomi Uemura. Bob MacArthur's been looking at his career. Bob?
Yes, that's right, Sue. Well, Mr. Uemura is certainly a remarkable man. In his life, he's achieved a number of firsts for the record books. But to begin with, here's a short biography. He was born in 1941. He was the youngest of 7 children. And in university, he achieved a degree in agriculture. But at the same time, I suppose he developed his taste for climbing mountains, especially alone. After he got his degree, he traveled to America with only $100 in his pocket. Anyway, he eventually made his way to Europe, and first of all, he climbed Mont Blanc, and this is despite the fact that he spoke very little English and no French at all. That was back in 1964. The next year, he joined the Japanese expedition to the Himalayas. This was the famous ascent of the Cho-Oyu. And in the years that followed, he wandered around the world with little money, and he just apparently looked for bigger mountains to climb. In 1966, he found himself in Africa, where he climbed Mount Kilimanjaro and Mount Kenya. And the next year, he climbed Mount Sanford in Alaska. And the year after that, he was down in Argentina and climbed sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my paper here, the Aconcagua, which is the highest mountain in the Andes. The same year, he floated on a wooden raft down the Amazon from its source to the mouth of the river, which I think is incredible.
Yes, indeed. And what did he do next? What happened after that?
Well, next was his famous, his first ascent of Everest. Uemura joined the Japanese expedition, they were making a reconnaissance of the southwest face. That was in 1969. He returned the next year. And that was the year that the expedition split in two. One group attempted to climb the difficult southwest face, and the other climbed the South Col route, which was easier. And Uemura joined the latter group. And as you may know, the members of the Southwest Face Party didn't make it, but the South Col Party eventually did. Anyway, the same year, he traveled to Alaska again to climb Mount McKinley. And so this made Uemura, the first man to get to the highest point of 5 different continents.
Yes. Wasn't he a member of that ill-fated International Everest expedition in 1971?
Yes.
The one that failed because of all those arguments that happened between all the members.
That's right. Yes, but they failed also because the weather was pretty bad. Uemura and his partner, for some reason, had to carry the supplies for the British pair, who insisted that they would do all the exciting climbing for themselves. So obviously there was a bit of resentment there.
Yes, no doubt that must have made him quite determined to just concentrate on solo expeditions after that.
Yes, apparently.
That experience. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I know that he's gone solo since then. In 1974, he set off in the middle of winter to cross the North American continent from Greenland to the Bering Straits by dog sled, which was an incredible idea in the first place. That's a distance of 12,000 kilometers. And, of course, this was totally by himself. The only company he had were his dogs. Apparently he met people on the way, but, he was doing it all himself. And he traveled in the winter, and in the summer he rested. And it took him 2 years. Eventually he got to the Pacific in 1976. Must have gotten a lot of reading done during the summer. Anyway, 2 years later, he found sponsors to finance a solo expedition to the North Pole. Supplies were flown in by plane, and he maintained radio contact with his sponsors, but he was completely alone out there. He was attacked by a polar bear. He nearly fell through the ice. It was incredible, but apparently he got from the northern part of Canada to the North Pole in 54 days. And the next year, not content with that, he crossed the entire Greenland ice cap, which is 2,250 kilometers, and it's part of some of the most bleakest terrain in the world.
Yes. And his dream is to cross the Antarctic continent alone, is it?
Yes. He's been preparing to try it. It's never been done before. But, if anyone can do it, I imagine he can. He's certainly determined. And he doesn't seem to mind the loneliness. Apparently he is a happily married family man. I don't know how he manages that. But anyway, if he can get permission and financial backing, there's really nothing to stop them. I guess after he does that, there won't be anything left for him to do.
Well, we'll see. Bob MacArthur, thank you very much.
It's all right.
You speak English, but you have an accent. Does that make you sound less intelligent, less educated? You might be surprised by what science says. This is a real conversation between native speakers discussing accents, class, and language identity. It's fast, it's natural, it's the kind of English that never appears in a textbook, and every word is right here on screen.
Speaking with an accent.
I think it's a great shame the way regional accents seem to be dying out in England, don't you?
I don't think they are. In fact, I think there's been a bit of a revival recently. I mean, maybe true of dialects, but not accents. In fact, the regional accent is socially acceptable in all walks of life now, I think. Think of the BBC. I mean, they have announcers and presenters with Scots accents, one of its political reporters has a strong Northern Ireland accent.
Yeah, you can't understand him very well.
No, seriously, I think it's wonderful. There's such an enormous range of accents in your country. Britain is I don't know, about a 16th the size of the States, but it's got more variety, more vocal variety than America.
All Americans sound the same to me. I mean, they all they all pronounce R at the end of every word.
Oh, that's not true.
Well, I don't know if that's true or not, but I mean, many British speakers do the same. You think of the West Country burr, and in Scotland there's a slight audible R at the end of words.
Oh, that reminds me. I heard about this strange experiment they did in New York City. Linguists wanted to find out if lower class and middle class people pronounce that R sound differently. So they chose these 3 department stores in New York. One was a high status, and one was medium status, one was low status. And they found out what departments were on a particular floor. For instance, they went around asking all the assistants where's the toy department or the bookstore or whatever, and they were all on the 4th floor. And so the answer they got was always 4th floor.
I like that.
Yeah.
Well, the trouble is when you ask someone to pronounce something, they affect a high status pronunciation. Thinking that's the correct way to talk, I suppose. Certainly in the UK, the people with strongest accents are working class, I think, as in the United States.
I thought about that.
You know what's strange is the way different sorts of accents, different sorts of sounds make you assume that people are slightly slow-witted or unintelligent, like West Country accents or Suffolk accent, because it's slow, a slow rural accent. But an urban accent like London or Liverpool just makes you sound uneducated. I mean, I know it's prejudice, but it's got something to do with what Ken's saying. But what I was trying to say is this the same in North America?
Yeah, probably to a lesser extent. I think there's a working class accent in New York City and Chicago, or pretty well any city, but especially
So
big
the
cities.
Bronx,
That's right.
you'd
People talk
think
like
of-
that, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything except that.
Do you have a rural accent the same?
Well, yes, there are rural accents. I mean, you've probably heard, hillbillies in the South or, in the Midwest. But it's funny because a lot of the American presidents came from the South, like Johnson and Carter, and they get made fun of, really.
Yeah.
Their accents, too.
What happened to me when I was in the States is people kept asking me to talk because they liked to listen to a British accent. I suppose it sounded sort of quaint to them. Waitresses in restaurants particularly.
Gee, I just love your
British accent, yeah.
Mind you, an accent like yours or mine, RP they call it, don't they, can be a handicap in some situations in this country. I mean, people think you're stuck up or trying to be superior.
Yes, but in general, RP has high prestige.
But it's funny because RP, as you call it, is only spoken by a tiny minority of people who speak English as their first language. So why is it, tell me, that it's become a model for almost all every foreigner learning the language?
Yes, mainly in Europe. It's not so much in Asia and Latin America. But I think it has to do with the prestige of RP in the UK. And the way it was the BBC accent for so long, BBC spans the world. And don't forget, RP, the accent of educated, middle-class Southern Britain, was also the accent of teachers.
Yeah, that's true. And also, I mean, there has got to be some sort of standard, even if it's an artificial one. Otherwise, people get confused and there's no sort of norm to stick to, is there? I mean, I've never met a foreigner that doesn't speak with an accent, but a national one rather than a regional one. And that's sometimes really enchanting, and I don't think we'd want to change that.
Thanks for being with us. See you on our next video. Let's speak up.